Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we are jumping in for another Founders Brewing Company review. We've got three completely different beers here and really nothing related. Just doing a review of some of the Founders offerings. Founders is one of the breweries I wanted to get deep and get more of their beers reviewed, as I am also going to be doing with other top craft brewers in the country. They are highly regarded as one of the best, and I absolutely agree with the critics. The beer that they put out is top notch, and we're going to jump in and see yet again exactly why Founders is such a special brewer. They are based out of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and we're going to be starting today with their porter. It is just called Porter. Porter the Porter, 6.5% ABV on this one. You know, they have a little bit of bottle art. It looks like an old-timey portrait, maybe from the Victorian era. I'm sure I'm getting glare from my set lights here, so it's probably hard to see. Moving on to number 2 is Dirty Bastard. This is a Scotch Ale, 8.5% ABV on this one. And then stepping up in ABV yet again, we move on to the Barrel Runner. This is an Imperial IPA that is mosaic hopped and rum barrel aged. 11.1% ABV on this one. So stepping up progressively in intensity here with the ABVs. All three of these beers, I imagine, are going to be excellent, and I can't wait to jump in, so we're going to do exactly that. We're going to get kicking off with the Porter at 6.5% ABV. Okay, so jumping into our first beer of today's Founders Review. This is their Porter, aptly named Porter, 6.5% ABV on this one. So before I jump in, you've heard me mention this before on prior reviews that all stouts are porters, but not all porters are stouts. You know, that's the thing. So what exactly is a stout and what exactly is a porter? There's a lot of debate, even to this day, but based on historical context, the generally accepted delineation between a stout and a porter is that porters typically are made from malted barley, whereas stouts are typically made from unmalted but roasted barley. That is the primary difference. So stout is just short for stout porter. All stouts are porters, but not all porters are stouts. And there's massive debate. You could go on about this endlessly, but this is a style that I absolutely love. Stout gets all the glory, and porter is just sitting in the corner as the unsung hero in my mind. But I absolutely love them. And let's pour this one in the glass and see what we're working with. Ooh, very dark, very thick. That's going to be a big porter. Big porter. Porters also, in my experience, tend to be quite a bit more effervescent than their stout counterparts. All right, I hold this up to the glass. This actually is as pitch black as the most dark pitch black Imperial Stout that I've ever looked into. I mean, this is deeply, deeply roasted malts. And when I was making the delineation between malted and unmalted, just roasted barley, this is still roasted. It just was malted first, but it gets its deep color from the roasting. Very deep roasting on this one, that much is clear. Bit more effervescent, so the head didn't stick around too long. It's got a little bit of a cling, a little pad on top, but again, it's not on a nitro tap, and it's not gonna form the same classic head as a stout would. That is for sure, but let's give this a sniff. Smells good. It smells like a classic porter, but clearly with much more deeply roasted barley in this than, say, your average porter. You can definitely smell the deep, deep roast edge to the malts in here. It also has a slight sweetness on the nose. That's not uncommon in a porter, but the balance of how that mixes, that deep roast and that slight sweetness, it smells really good, like it's going to be really rich. So let's find out if it is. Jumping right in. Oh, oh, okay. Oh man. Oh, oh wow. This is such a good porter, it's ridiculous. I'm going to come out and say it right now. This is one of the best porters I've ever had in my life. And yes, I have had this beer many times, though it has been a while. But jumping back in with a really critical eye, it's always exciting to revisit beers that you enjoy. And this is no exception. Okay, the first thing I got to tell you about this porter is these malts, as we could see just by looking at it, are so deeply roasted that it does impart that classic stout quality where it tastes of coffee. Very much of a deep, rich roast like a French or Italian roast coffee bean. French being the deeper. It's really just the edge of burn. They pull them right before the beans hit the smoke point is why French roast coffee is so pungent. It's the deepest roast of coffee that there is. This tastes like a very deep Italian or French roast, somewhere between the two. It's not quite as intense as you get in a French roast, but it's certainly between the Italian and the French roast coffee threshold, and it imparts these deep, rich coffee-like flavors. Also, due to these roasted malts, they may have used some chocolate malt in this as well, but there's a definite chocolate undertone to it too. It really tastes like deep, rich, roasted coffee and baker's chocolate, or a very bitter chocolate, like predominantly cocoa, less sugar kind of chocolate. This is so good. I'm going to jump in again, see if I can pick up this mouthfeel and body and explore this finish. The body is medium to medium heavy for a porter. It's got some substance to it. And the mouthfeel is interesting because it's a little effervescent, but it's also really creamy, and it's also got some viscosity to it. So it's kind of the trifecta of all the best character traits that you could want for in a porter rolled into one. This is just excellent, excellent beer. The finish, all right, from the second it gets in your mouth, the initial taste starts with that slight sweetness, and it tastes very malty. That sweetness gets out of the way and opens up to a slightly earthy profile for about half a second to a second, and then that opens just completely smack you in the face with these deeply, deeply richly roasted malts. I mean, just deeply richly roasted malts. And all of that coffee and chocolate flavor just comes on in full force, and it just blooms into this massive kind of apex of the bell curve, and then it slowly starts to taper off. It's got a very long finish. It's very clean, and it's very even with these flavors, and then some of that earthiness comes back in, and some of that slight sweetness comes back in, but it is dominated by a very coffee forward and chocolate forward flavor, and this is just delicious. It smells great, it looks great, it's got a fantastically large body, 6.5%, that's higher than your average porter, but it's not insane. A really big body for its ABV. Mouthfeel is amazing, the finish is really long, and you can really pick out everything that's in it. Really, this is just a fantastic beer. I'm going to take my time sipping on this, come up with my scores, and when we come back, we'll move on to number 2, the Dirty Bastard Scotch Ale at 8.5% ABV. Okay, moving on to our second beer of today's Founders Review is Dirty Bastard. Scotch Ale for the style, it's 8.5% ABV. On the label, it kind of looks like a wily Scotsman, a bit with, I don't know. It's tough to say. You know, their label art's rather subdued as well. Scotch ales. Scotch ales typically have peated or smoked malts in their malt bill. It's kind of one of the hallmarks. They don't all, but that is typical that you're going to get kind of a smoked peated flavor, often an aroma as well. So let's get this poured in and see what we think on the front end of this. Oh yeah, that's a lovely looking Scotch ale. It's a nice rich color. They tend to be darker beers like this, kind of caramelly, not dark like a stout or a porter, but darker in nature, almost like a strong ale. Porter Great Head, that's rather a textbook Scotch ale head. They do get nice creamy foamy heads. It's effervescent, but it's really fine bubbles, and it's just kind of doing its thing. Looks beautiful. Head formed wonderfully. That's a beautifully creamy head. Let's give this a sniff. Not the most pronounced aroma in the world. It smells slightly sweet and malty, which perhaps this is a more sweet Scotch ale. I've only had one or two that I would ever categorize as sweet. They kind of remind me of a few different styles, strong ales in particular, and Scotch wee heavies, certainly probably the closest relative. But they kind of run the gamut, so they're all a little bit different. Yeah, it smells nice. It does smell sweet though, almost akin to an Oktoberfest aroma without the hoppy edge to it. But that head is looking beautiful. It's not too high. I'm going to jump right in. Oh, that's a nice Scotch ale. Oh, that's very deep, very rich. Okay, so the sweetness you get on the aroma, you don't really get in the flavor at all. In fact, I'm just going to come right out and say it. This reminds me of a cousin, like they could be related from the same family tree as Stone Arrogant Bastard, which is funny since they both have bastard in the name. That's a strong ale. This is a Scotch ale. This tastes remarkably similar to that, only less hoppy. But don't get me wrong, this has actually got some forward, readily apparent bitters in it, which is not the norm for a Scotch ale. It's very nice. And it's definitely got a nice caramelly malt back to it. It's very rich, very caramelly, almost buttery in its way that it develops. And then you have this nice burst of bitter that comes through. I didn't pick up a lot of smoke or peat, so they don't all. But this is a nice beer. This is very enjoyable. I would put this certainly in the top tier of Scotch ales I've ever had. This is a very, very well done Scotch ale indeed. 8.5%. It's got some bones. I'm going to jump in for body, mouthfeel, and finish. For a Scotch ale, that's got a heavy body. It's not heavy comparative to, say, an Imperial Stout, but it's heavy for a Scotch ale. The mouthfeel, it's got a nice mouthfeel. It's kind of like the Porter was. It's a little creamy, slightly effervescent, and got this viscosity to it. This is certainly more viscous. I think the 2% higher ABV probably goes to play in to that a lot. Actually, I just caught my eye on the back of the label, 50 IBUs. That's not common for a Scotch ale, so they definitely decided to be generous with the hopping in this beer, and it really kicks it up that extra level of special for me. The finish, it really, exactly as I described, that's how it comes on. You get this nice burst of all this flavor, and it opens up into what you first get is just the slight hint of sweetness that goes away. Then it opens into this wonderful, rich, deep caramel, like buttery, almost like a Crunch and Munch, buttered toffee flavored Crunch and Munch. Yeah, that confection that they sell in boxes. I think it might have Benjamin Franklin on the label or something, but it puts me in mind of that. It's a very rich, very enjoyable, buttery, savory kind of caramelly flavor that comes through. And then you just get hit with this burst of hops, just this burst of beautiful bitters. And it doesn't overshadow the malt, which is really the cornerstone of this beer style. That's really what you're in to taste it. And from there, after that explosion, they all kind of meld together, and then it's a very even distribution all the way down, and it just tapers in its presence as it finally drifts away from your palate. I can still taste some of that caramel, and getting some of that hop bitter essence still on the back of my palate. It's probably been 30-45 seconds since I had that last sip. It's got a terrifically long finish. It's very enjoyable. It's very smooth. This is a very, very well-balanced beer. Gonna go in for one more sip just to explore this flavor profile, make sure I didn't miss anything. Slight sweetness, caramel explosion, buttery, savory goodness, bitters. Now they're all starting to combine. That's it. That's how this flavor develops, and then it's just going to keep that even distribution and just slowly peter off over time. This is a very, very, very well done Scotch ale. I absolutely love this beer. If you're a fan of the style or if you've never tried it, I highly recommend this one. If you're into bigger, bolder, stronger beers, and this isn't as bitter as, say, like a really heavily hopped IPA, don't get me wrong, but for a Scotch ale, this is ridiculously hop forward. It certainly is more hoppy, in my opinion, than the average even session IPA. It's got a nice bitter presence to it. This is a fantastic beer. I'm going to take my time sipping on this one, come up with my scores. When we come back, we'll get to our third and final beer, today's Founders Review. That is the Barrel Runner. This is an Imperial IPA hopped with Mosaic hops, and it's been rum barrel aged, and that one clocks in at 11.1%. Okay, now we move on to our third and final beer of today's review. This is the Barrel Runner Imperial IPA, 11.1% ABV. It's been Mosaic hopped and rum barrel aged. Not really much in the way of bottle art to talk about on here. It looks like maybe there's a pirate very faint in the background. But nonetheless, we're going to get this poured straight in. All right. Okay. Appearance-wise, this looks pretty much exactly as I expected for an Imperial IPA. Typically, they're a little deeper amber hue, little kind of caramel colored in appearance, and this indeed does appear to be so. It's not overtly effervescent, but there's a nice little tight stream of bubbles coming up. The head formed pretty nicely, I thought. It looks pretty creamy. There's a little mix of medium, fine, and large bubbles, so we'll see how long it holds, but it already looks like pretty much spot on right there, so I'm not complaining about how the head poured on this one at all. Let's give it a sniff. Yeah, okay, that smells like a big beer. You can definitely smell the hops up front, and you can smell the rum barrel up front, and you can smell kind of the caramelly edge to all those malts that went in here. 11.1% ABV. They put a lot of grains in this malt bill to get that ABV up that high. So I'm not surprised by that at all. Yeah, it smells really good. Let's dive right in. Head is looking good. That's a nice beer. That's a very nice beer. Oh, wow. They used quite a lot of Mosaic hops in there. They come through very, very strongly about midway through the flavor opening up. Up front, you get kind of the caramelly grain that I expect really from any Imperial. Once I've talked about this many times. As a rule, I don't normally go for double, triple, Imperial, quad, whatever IPA because I prefer a more hop-centric IPA, more true to the style where the hop is the hero and the malts stay out of the way and let the hop sing. And often when you get the ABVs up this high, that many fermentables, the malt base starts to overshadow the hop. They put a good amount of hops in here. It's really coming through. And it mixes very, very well with that caramelly nature to the malts, which is most definitely the nature that these malts have, as I expected. But you get this massive burst of that rum barrel that comes through as well, and it really is almost in equal parts hop, malt, and rum barrel. It's exceptionally well balanced. Gonna jump back in here for body, mouthfeel, and finish. Okay, body is heavy as you might expect. Mouthfeel is creamy but viscous. Not super viscous, but it's got some thickness to it. The finish, all of that flavor profile ride that I just described, I got it right on my first sip in. Finish-wise, it kind of apexes with Mosaic hop and rum barrel with caramel taking to the back before it starts its downward descent in intensity of flavor for the finish here. As it continues to go, the dominant flavors that I'm getting are hop up front, rum barrel aging second, and then the malt bill third. And honestly, for me, for an Imperial IPA and for what they did with this, that is the right balance. That's the order of operations that I want it to have. Always hops first in an IPA. I don't care what you do to the beer. I don't care what style it is. If the hop is not front and center and it's not the star of the show, it's not gonna. I'm not saying it's a bad beer. I'm not saying it's not an enjoyable beer. I'm just saying it's not taking the IPA style to heart. It's all about the hop. That's how the style was born, and that's what I like to see in an IPA. This is a very, very, very good example of how to do an Imperial IPA properly. The balance on this is great. They put a lot of thought into what they wanted this beer to be, and I think that they absolutely nailed it. This is a very, very good beer. I'm going to take my time and sip on this one and come up with my scores, and then when we come back, we will get all three beers ranked top to bottom. All right, now that we've gotten to enjoy all three of these delicious offerings by Founders, we're going to go down and give them their ratings. So starting at the top with the porter, this was 6.5%. To recap, Founders is based out of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Okay, starting with the aroma. This had a very, very nice aroma for a porter, and it was quite more pronounced than the average. Not ridiculously pungent, but certainly well above average, and it gets an 8. For the taste, this was textbook, deep, rich, decadent, roasty porter at its finest. I gave it a perfect 10 out of 10. For the body was very nice. It was quite a bit more substantial than your average porter. It had a 6.5% ABV. Not out of range for a porter, maybe on the high end, but wasn't quite as robust as those on the highest high end. I gave it a 9. The mouthfeel on this was excellent. Just classic porter. It was very smooth, had a little bit of effervescence, and it was really, really close to a perfect example. I gave that also a 9. For the finish. The finish on this one was very nice, and it was quite long. Not as long as some of the longest I've ever had, but it was really, really well above average. You could really taste all the different layers of the malt and the different roast levels and the interplay, and it just kept going. I also gave that a 9. For the head retention on this was okay. It was certainly above average, not the best, not the worst, but again, pouring it home, you know, it's kind of luck of the draw. It gets a 7. Appearance-wise, this was a beautiful looking porter. It was deep and rich and dark. In fact, it was darker than average, but that's not a knock for the style. It can kind of run the gamut. This was on the deeper, darker end of the spectrum. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For balance, this was an exceptionally well-balanced porter. It was a wonderful, wonderful balance of the ingredients that went in, and I really appreciated that I could pick all of them out individually and that none of them really overshadowed the other. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Feeling an intangible, I absolutely loved it. This is one of the best porters I could think of off the top of my head, and it also gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style, porters are an interesting style. They're easy to screw up, and you know, they're the unsung, one of the unsung heroes of the dark beer styles, and there's many. But you know, stouts seem to get all the attention, and porters are always playing second fiddle. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. That brings the total score on the Founders Porter to a 92 out of 100. Very, very high score. Moving on to beer number 2, that's the Dirty Bastard Scotch Ale, 8.5% ABV. This one, the aroma was nice. It was a little more pungent than your average beer, but not above average by any stretch. I gave it a 6. Taste on this, though, was absolutely fantastic. This was a wonderful, wonderful Scotch ale, and it had every hallmark characteristic of a Scotch ale. Granted, some are peated and have smoked kind of malts in them, and you'll get that. It's not indicative of the style, though it is relatively common. This didn't appear to have any. If they did, it was very minimal to where it didn't override the other flavor profiles, but I thought the taste was a home run. I gave it a 10 out of 10. The body on this, 8.5% ABV on a Scotch ale, and they do tend to have some higher ABVs. It had some substance, and certainly it was well above average on that end. I give the body a perfect 10 out of 10. Mouthfeel, this was a textbook Scotch ale mouthfeel. I wouldn't change a thing if I could. Perfect 10 out of 10. Finish on this, very, very long, very layered. Just like with the porter, you got to taste all of the layers of flavor in harmony, and that's such a key. Not only length, but how it develops and how they play out. It was a wonderful example of a Scotch ale. I gave it a 9 out of 10 for the finish. Head and retention on this one. This was so lush and creamy, I had a hard time believing it, but it was a beautiful Scotch ale and poured at my house. I had to give it a perfect 10 out of 10. Appearance-wise, this was textbook Scotch ale. I mean, that's exactly what they look like. That's the definition. It gets a 10 out of 10. Balance on this one. Just like with the porter, this was exceptionally well balanced, and it was well balanced for all of the exact same reasons. All of the layers of flavor that go into making this beer style were working together in completely perfect harmony. There was nothing that really overshadowed anything else. You could pick out all the individual characteristics across flavor and aroma, and the body and the mouthfeel and the finish. It was just a beautifully well put together beer. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Feeling and intangible, you might be able to guess, but I absolutely loved it, and I love Scotch ales. It's one of my favorite styles in the world. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style, while this may not be Scottish, this American representation of a Scotch ale is as good as any Scottish Scotch ale I've ever had. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. That brings the total score on the Dirty Bastard to a 95 out of 100, another ridiculously high score. Moving on to our third and final beer, this is the Barrel Runner Imperial IPA, 11.1%, rum barrel aged, mosaic hopped. This was a really good beer. The aroma on it was nice. It was certainly above average for an Imperial IPA, and you could really get a sense of what you're about to get into. I gave it an 8 out of 10. Taste, I really enjoyed it. It was certainly more hop forward than the average Imperial, but I still want more hops, and I would have liked a little more rum to come through on the flavor profile. It was certainly there, but I would have liked a little more intensity if they're going to take the time to rum barrel age it. Just go big. Not that they didn't, but it was just one point I docked. I gave it a 9 for the taste. Body on this, 11.1 ABV on an Imperial. You know this had a heavy body, and it certainly did. That gets a perfect 10 out of 10. The mouthfeel on this. This was such a great mouthfeel. Not only for an IPA, but certainly for a higher ABV Imperial IPA. It was very smooth. It was very creamy, bordering on silky. Had a little bit of effervescence due to the fermentables, but excellent mouthfeel on this one. It gets a 9. Moving on to the finish. The finish was really good. It was certainly well above average, though I was kind of surprised it didn't last as long as I thought that it would. I expected the rum to kind of carry even longer and longer and longer, and certainly with a higher ABV, I expected more malt, and since I could tell that they hopped it quite heavily for an Imperial, I expected that to last a little bit longer, but it didn't. It was above average, but not upper echelon. It gets a 7. Head and retention on this. This was a really nice head that it poured. Considering at home, not on a tap again, kind of luck of the draw, but it was well above average. It gets an 8 out of 10. Moving on to the appearance, this was textbook Imperial IPA. They're going to be kind of a caramelly color in appearance. They have more fermentables in them, and it's hard to escape that. That is the textbook appearance for one. It gets a 10 out of 10. Balance on this. Again, this is another extremely well-balanced beer, and it's continuing the trend with the prior two. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10, and this is one of the things that sets Founders apart from other high-end, highly lauded craft beer brewers in America. Their balance on their beers are so well done that it lets every part that they put into the beer and the beer style, what they're trying to create, really have its own voice, and nothing really comes out in the forefront and drowns anything out. And that's such a testament to how well they craft the beers that they're designing for us to enjoy. It gets perfect 10 out of 10. Again, filling in intangible, I just would have liked a little more hop presence still and a little more rum presence, and I would have kicked it up, but it still gets an excellent score. It gets a 9. Finally, as an example of the style, I mimic my feeling in intangible. It gets a 9. Really, really excellent example of how to put more hops into a high ABV Imperial, how to let the malts come through but not drown out the hops. And if you're going to rum barrel age, yeah, absolutely go for it. It works for this style. I just still would like a little more hop presence and a little more barrel presence in this beer, but it was not shy of perfection as an example of the style by much. Total score on the Barrel Runner is an 89. So all total, we're only looking at a 6-point spread across all 3 beers, and all of them are absolute upper echelon end of the rating scale. This is yet another perfect example of why Founders is regarded as one of the best craft breweries in America, and I stand by the critics and fans alike. It absolutely is. They produce top-notch world-class beers, and you really can't go wrong just picking one. Certainly everybody has their favorites. Certainly there are some that are even better than others, but you really can't go wrong picking a beer by Founders. They put absolute love and attention to detail in their beers, and it 100% shows for you when you get to enjoy them. Ladies and gentlemen, as always, thank you so much for joining us. I really do appreciate it. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already done so. And if you want to keep in the loop when our videos go live, just click the notification bell. It'll let you know right when they drop live to YouTube. And comments are really big, so please, I know I mentioned comments, but I would like to interact with you. So please feel free to drop me a line, let me know what your thoughts are, what you like, what you dislike, any questions you may have, any suggestions for future videos. Please let me know. I am taking all of your input to heart. And until next time, folks, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.